What do you think?
Reliability, yes, but for what?
So should you choose a measure because it's short? It may be important to you if you're measuring a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be your main justification. You don't choose a measure because it is short. You have to use a measure because it is the most appropriate measure for what you're trying to measure, not because it's short, right? But we are now used to seeing things like that, and they don't bother anybody. But this is poor. This is not a good, strong argument. Okay? I will say more about the reliability thing in a second, so keep that in mind. How about this one? How do they chose the POMs in this study? Is this a good justification, a poor justification, and why? What are they saying? So in this case, they're saying we chose it because it's popular. It's popular. A lot of people use it. Is that a good argument? We chose this because a lot of people use it? It's fashionable, right? And then another thing they say, sensitivity to mood changes. What are the key psychometric properties? Two of them. Reliability we mentioned. What's the other one? Validity. Reliability, validity. What is sensitivity? Is there a psychometric property called sensitivity? No. So what does sensitivity really mean? The scores change. So we like that. We like that the scores change. Okay? Is it perhaps that you like the way that the scores change? Is it that the scores confirm what you wanted to show? Right? So always remember that the argument has to be made in terms of reliability and validity. There is no such thing as sensitivity. Sensitivity a lot of times means the measure tends to confirm what I believe. Okay? How about this one? This is the PANAS. They use the PANAS. Why did they use the PANAS? So, let me ask you this. They say because it is a reliable and valid measure, right? Let me ask a very difficult question, and this is for the researchers. Is reliability an inherent property of the measure? Can you say that a measure is reliable or has reliability? It's a trick question, so think before you answer. So what is the meaning of reliability? It's the inverse of measurement error, random measurement error, right? It tends to have a lot of the variance is reliable variance, little of the variance, very little of the variance is random measurement error. So let me ask the question again. Can you say that a measure is reliable or has reliability? So the measure is sort of built in, reliability is built into the measure, and you can take the measure any way you want and it will still keep its reliability. Reliability, remember, the inverse of random measurement error. So can random measurement error vary? Can it differ? How? How can you increase the amount of random measurement error? What about the subject? Cultural differences. Differences in understanding, right? How about if I'm exhausted and it's the end of the day and I'm hungry and I'm not paying much attention? Would I be making more mistakes? Would I be increasing my random measurement error, therefore reducing my reliability? Yes? So it's important for us to understand that reliability is not built into the measure, right? Measures don't have reliability. The data that you collect with the measures have reliability or don't have reliability. So we shouldn't say we use this because in other cases, with other samples, at other times, it has been shown to be reliable, right? That's not a strong enough justification. Okay. There is a set of guidelines called the Consort Guidelines. And again, researchers will know about this. This is reporting guidelines if you have done a randomized controlled trial. Okay? So because people were not reporting very important pieces of information about randomized controlled trials, researchers developed these guidelines to make sure that everything is reported. So an extension of the control guidelines refers to patient-reported outcomes, self-reports, questionnaires, when the outcome is self-reported by the participants. Okay? This is the example that they used. If you have done a randomized control trial, this is how you should report the justification of your measure. Can you read it and tell me if it's a good justification? It's everything that we just said you shouldn't do. Yes? Because they say it has well-established reliability and validity, and I just told you, no, reliability and validity are not properties of the measure, are properties of the data that you've collected with the measure at a particular situation. And then they also say it is used frequently, as if that is somehow important. Okay? So what I'm trying to say is, don't make the mistakes that a lot of other researchers make in justifying the selection of your measure. Okay? A lot of times we just see what other people do, the way that they justify their measures, and we just do the same. And what I'm telling you is, these are not good arguments. So I'll skip that, make it easy, skip that, make it easy. So let's talk about the state trait anxiety inventory. So one thing to understand is that the state trait anxiety inventory was based on a very specific theory of anxiety to measure a very specific outcome. And that outcome is state trait anxiety, the way that the developer, Spielberger, defined state anxiety. State anxiety is an emotional state characterized by subjective, consciously perceived feelings of apprehension and tension accompanied by or associated with activation or arousal of the autonomic nervous system. So this was the theory. If this is what you're doing to your participants, if you're manipulating their cognitive appraisal of threat, then STAI would be an appropriate measure. But in our field, the STAI has been used as a measure of how people feel in general. And it was never designed to be used that way. It was only designed to be used as a measure of state anxiety. So if you have an experimental manipulation that changes people's appraisal of threat, then it's appropriate to use it. But it was never meant to be a measure of generally how people feel. Now, the situation got much worse in the case of exercise. And I will try to explain why. Let me skip a few things. So here's a weird finding. If you keep administering this scale, the state trait anxiety inventory, what you will find is that during exercise, state trait anxiety inventory scores increase. Does that mean that people become more state anxious during exercise? And before you answer, let me show you some examples of the items. So look at the items and pretend that you are responding to this questionnaire while exercising at 80% of your max. If you're exercising at 80% of your max and I come up to you and I say, hey, how calm are you? What would you say? Very calm?
Not.
No, you would say I'm not calm at all. Why? Because I'm about to die, right? It's very hard. It's very strenuous exercise. But the way that the questionnaire was built, if you said, I don't feel calm, that meant I'm very anxious. It was never designed to be used with exercise. It was designed to be used if you're an anxiety patient and you're sitting in a session of psychotherapy and somebody asks, so are you calm? Yes, now I'm more calm. Okay? But imagine using that question in an exercise context. So. So what about him? Michael Johnson, right? Everybody knows who that person is? Only old people know who that person is. Yeah, that's right. You need to be over 40. Okay. So, is he frightened? Is he worried? Is he worrying? Is he anxious? Is he regretful? I think this was like, what, the 110th race that he had won consecutively. It was the Olympics, 96 Olympics in Atlanta. Do you think that he's worried? He just finished and got another gold medal, right? But is he calm? Have you ever ran 400 meters? It's the worst experience in the world, right? It's the worst thing. Is he relaxed? Is he at ease? So clearly what we have here is a problem, right? It's a significant problem. The questionnaire includes items that take an entirely different meaning during exercise. They were never supposed to be used during exercise. And when you use them during exercise, what you have is an enormous validity crisis. So, we administered the SDAI to women who were doing an aerobics class, and we found the same thing. During the aerobics, the women gave us higher state anxiety scores. Were they more anxious? No, clearly not. This is what happened. They felt less at ease, less calm, less relaxed, less steady. And all of those counted as higher anxiety. But of course, they were not feeling higher anxiety. They were feeling activation because of the exercise. Because at the same time, they said, I feel less worried, less nervous, less worried. Am I making sense? So how about the POMS? Does anybody here use the POMS ever or is familiar with the POMS? Okay. So very popular measure, as I said, especially with exercise. It measures 5 negative things and 1 positive thing. Okay? Tension, depression, anger, fatigue, and confusion are the bad things, and then vigor is the good thing. Question for you. So these are supposed to be mood states. If you administer the POMS during exercise and you measure these 6 things, and you find nothing, you find no change, can you conclude that exercise had no effect on mood? If mood is this big pie, the 6 things that the POMS measures cover parts of the pie, but they don't cover the entire pie. Can you think of other moods other than these 6? Irritability, cheerfulness, right? So who decided that only those 6 will be parts of the POMS? That's what a lot of people do not understand. They don't go back to find the history of it. So here's how the POMS was developed. Soldiers were coming back from the Vietnam War. And they were suffering from something that later became known as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. At the time, it didn't have that name, but they knew that it was related to stress and anxiety. Back then, psychiatry was not the way that it is today, so a lot of psychiatry was based on trial and error. They would give a pill, they would see if it helps. If it didn't, they would try another pill. Okay? So that's what psychiatrists were doing. And these particular psychiatrists, McNair and Lohr, wanted to have a questionnaire to assess whether their drugs that they were trying were helping. So they sat together and they decided, okay, what do we want to measure for these soldiers? Well, anxiety, depression, fatigue, which is a common side effect of psychiatric drugs, the sense of energy, and then somebody also said, and confusion, because sometimes confused thoughts is another side effect of psychiatric drugs. Now stop. Is confusion a mood? Confusion is not a mood. So how did it end up in the POMS? It ended up in the POMS because the POMS was never supposed to be used with you and me. It was supposed to be used when it was developed with soldiers coming back from Vietnam who were given different types of psychiatric drugs. But now we use it with exercise. Is it relevant to exercise? Was it developed for exercise? Does it make sense to use it with exercise? Clearly no. So I'm skipping, and we come to dimensional measures. So dimensional measures try to capture, is that a question?
Yeah.
Okay, sure, good.
Probably is pretty much the same thing about the POMS, but what do you think about the Brunel mood scale? It's a short version of the POMS. For shortness.
Is the camera rolling?
Yes.
Can you turn it off for a second? Because these are friends of mine. I don't want to say anything bad. Okay, so the POMS is a copyrighted questionnaire. Okay, copyright. It's produced by a publisher. The people who developed the Brunel inventory, initially they did not call it the Brunel, what is it, the Brunel mood scale?
Yeah.
Yeah. They called it POMS-A, POMS for adolescents. So it was a shortened version of the POMS that was meant to be used with adolescents, okay? What they didn't think is that the initial POMS are copyrighted. So then the publisher found out and sent them a very bad letter, back in those days, no email, a very nasty letter that said, you're violating our copyright, you cannot call this the POMS. So then they said, oops, we're sorry, and they called it the Brunel mood scale. But in essence, it is a simplified, shortened version of the POMS. So everything that I just told you about the POMS, the fact that it doesn't capture the whole pie, the fact that it was developed for a very specific purpose to capture reactions of soldiers to psychiatric drugs, everything applies to the Brunel measure as well. For all practical purpose, just a shortened POMS by different name to avoid copyright violation. Okay, so this is Wundt, one of the fathers of modern psychology, right? He was the first one who came up with the idea that everything that we feel is in fact a composite of certain ingredients, a mixture of certain ingredients. And what are those ingredients? Again, he was the first one who said everything that we feel is produced by blending two things, pleasure versus displeasure, and high excitement versus low excitement, high arousal, high activation versus low activation. The year was 1896. And nobody paid attention to this. It was this was based on his own introspection, right? This is how psychology was done in the 1800s. So it took many, many, many years, this is 1980, for some data to come up to suggest that in fact, what people feel is a composite of two basic ingredients. One ingredient is what you're feeling pleasant or unpleasant, and the second is what you're feeling a high or a low. And if you combine those two, you produce basically any variety of human feeling. So to give you some idea, right, we call this dimension affective valence, pleasure versus displeasure. We call this dimension activation. If you combine positive valence with high activation, you get high activation pleasant states. I'll show you some examples in a second. If you combine low activation unpleasantness, low activation unpleasant states, high activation unpleasant, low activation pleasant. So this is from English words. If you do an analysis, this is how they line up. Pleasant things, unpleasant things. High activation things that are neither pleasant nor unpleasant, they're neutral. Low activation things that are neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Mixtures of high activation with pleasure, mixtures of low activation with displeasure. Mixtures of high activation with displeasure, mixtures of low activation with pleasure. You can run a factor analysis with Portuguese words like this, and we can sign a contract that you will find this very nice circular arrangement. So this is a very reliable, very robust finding across the world. So we call this the affect circle. Why is this useful? Why is this interesting? Because you can think of this as your two-dimensional map of how people feel. And you can plot how someone feels in response to an exercise session by just only asking valence and activation. You can construct a two-dimensional map, and then you can plot. People usually start from down here, and then they go here, or they go here, or they go here, or they return here, and so forth. And you can see almost like a map of what happened, a trajectory of their affective space, of affective changes, by asking only two fundamental easy questions. So the way that we ask those questions was already discussed. It's the feeling scale to measure affective valence, pleasure, displeasure, and it's the felt arousal scale to measure activation. Question for you. Practical question for the researchers. How should you administer those two scales? I will give you some different possibilities. Possibility number one, you put them on the same page, side by side, both of them arranged vertically. Possibility number two, you put them on the same page, but you arrange one horizontally and the other vertically. Possibility number three, you put them on different pages. Possibility number four, you put them on different pages and you change the order. You randomize the order. You give one first, one time, and then another, the other first, the other time. What is the preferred method? And also explain to me why. If you are a researcher and you've used these measures, you should have an opinion. Let me go back to the first option. Good idea, bad idea, and why?
Probably you can transfer.
Yep, go ahead. Keep going.
Probably looking both in the same situation, you can transfer and make confusion.
This is variance transfer. If you're doing research, please take this seriously. This is variance transfer. You ask people, how do you feel? And they look at the first scale, let's say they pick a 3, and then what do? They move horizontally to the next. Without resetting their mind to think, what is the other scale? Variance transfer. What is supposed to be the correlation between valence and activation, theoretically? 0. They're supposed to be uncorrelated. But by doing this, putting them side by side and both of them oriented vertically, what happens is that you artificially inflate the correlation. You make people forget what this one measures and what that one measures, which are very different things. So what you want to do is completely dissociate the two scales as much as possible. The simplest method to do that is to orient them differently, but I would highly recommend that you take as many steps as possible, and the best one is the last option. 2 different pages and randomize the order of presentation so that every time they respond, they have to think, what is this one asking? And not respond the same way that they responded to the last one. Okay? Am I making sense? So this is known as common method bias. So you have to look it up and you have to read more on common method bias. The worst thing that I have ever seen in this regard is a study in which they did this. They used the Borg CR10 scale to measure perceived exertion and pain, and they put the 2 scales side by side, identical scales side by side. The average Borg CR10 at the end of the study was 8.2. Please guess what the average pain rating was. 8.2. Because people just went like this without thinking what each of the scales measures. You understand it? Yes? So I also recommend that you don't think only in terms of the feeling scale. The feeling scale was selected, it's been used, I understand that, but nobody ever said that it is the best scale. So there is what they call an empirical valence scale that was developed in 2008. And this one, as you can see, has different distances between the different anchors. And those distances were empirically derived. So they actually, the distances represent what people are saying the appropriate distance is between the different descriptors. Okay? So presumably this may be a better scale than the feeling scale. So let's not get stuck on the feeling scale. Okay? Let me say one thing about the PANAS, and I know that we're running out of time, of course. Anybody has used the PANAS or is interested in the PANAS? Nobody? So the PANAS has something that is very threatening, and that is the name. Positive affect, negative affect. So a lot of people think positive affect means happy, and negative affect means sad. And that has led to thousands of publications that are completely missing the point. Because happy is not positive affect, and sad is not negative affect. So this is the actual theoretical basis of the PANAS. Can you see where happy and sad is, and how that is different from the way that positive affect and negative affect is defined in the theory? All right, nobody uses the PANAS. Huh? So positive affect in the theory behind the PANAS is only a combination of pleasure with high activation. And negative affect in the PANAS is a combination of negative affect with high activation. It's not pleasure, displeasure. Pleasure, displeasure is a different dimension from positive affect and negative affect. So if you ever use the PANAS, please don't make that mistake. Because nobody uses the PANAS, I'm going to skip. and I'm going to skip this one because I don't think anybody uses that one. So, if I can have your attention for just, these 3 slides. One of the reasons why I traveled, 5,000 miles or whatever it is to get here, as I was, I was explaining to Professor Santos, to me, what you represent is the next wave. You represent the future, the researchers of tomorrow. And I want to make sure that as we move forward, we will minimize the mistakes. I feel very protective of this area, and I want this area of research to thrive. And it can only thrive if we're very careful and very accurate and very precise, and we do good science. So I want all of us, especially you, because you're now producing the data. I'm just standing here and talking to myself. But you are doing the research. So how should you justify the selection of your measures? What you have to promise me is that you will never say, I'm using these measures because Ekekakis uses these measures. If we do that, honestly, there is no tomorrow. The research will die. We need to do better. We need to do better. So what I have done here is I have proposed a 3-step system, and I ask you kindly to try as much as possible when you justify a measure to stick to this 3-step system. Number 1, you have to answer the question, what is it that you're interested in? Core affect, mood, or emotion, and why? Distinguish the 3, make sure you understand the differences, and justify it. Are you ready for step number 2? So now that you know what you want to study, the next question to ask yourself is, for each of the 3 constructs, core affect, mood, emotion, there are multiple theories, multiple conceptual models. So you have to ask yourself, what is the best conceptual model for the construct that I want to study, and why? So you have to consider how many factors, how many dimensions, what is the relationship between the dimensions, what is the polarity of the dimensions. You have to understand your measure. And then the 3rd step is, now that I know what construct I want to study, and I know what conceptual model of the construct I want to use, I want to look at the psychometric data. In previous uses, what is the evidence of reliability? In previous uses, what is the evidence of validity? In my population, and even better in my sample, what is the evidence of reliability? What is the evidence of validity? But you don't get to the psychometrics before you answer the previous 2 questions. 3-step system. Okay? So let me give you an example. This is a hypothetical with a measure that you probably haven't seen because I wanted to make it irrelevant to the measures that we all know. Step number 1. Consistent with the aim of the present study, the targeted construct was core affect. So clearly you say, this is what I'm studying. Okay? Why? Core affect is defined as the most elementary, consciously accessible affective feelings. As such, core affect is generally considered the most general construct in the hierarchy of affective constructs, being broader than mood and broader than emotion. So I don't want to focus on a particular type of emotion, a particular type of mood. What I want to do is have a broad perspective. For example, I want to study the affective responses to samba. What are they? I don't know. So how do I go into this study? With the broadest, most balanced, and most inclusive perspective possible. And core affect will give you that broad perspective. You understand? Step number 2. So now we have to say why we chose a particular conceptual model. Under the present combination of experimental conditions, it was not possible to predict the exact nature of affective responses that would be elicited from physical activity and smoking. Thus, instead of focusing on a few distinct varieties of affect, it was deemed preferable to attempt to capture this global domain of content in a more encompassing fashion. To this end, core affect was conceptualized as a domain defined by a set of basic dimensions. Specifically, the measurement approach was based on the circumplex, according to which the domain of core affect can be defined by 2 orthogonal and bipolar dimensions, namely affective valence and perceived activation. Right? I chose this particular conceptual model called the circumplex because it fits my needs. It fits the particular needs of this study. Yes? And then you go to step 3, where you justify on psychometric grounds why you chose this particular measure. So to operationalize these dimensions, we use the composite short form of the Swedish core affect scales, and then you give your psychometric information. Does that make sense? Okay.
You run between the 3 steps, right?
So it looks like a lot because I wanted to make it clear, but a shortened version of the 3 steps I think should be in your measure section. I chose this construct, I used this conceptual model of the construct, I used this particular measure based on the conceptual model. And I think I'm out of time. So I know it was hard I said it was a technical talk, and I apologize, but I hope that those of you who are researchers and are using these measures got something out of it. So thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Você vai estar fazendo milagre aí, hein?
Thanks so much, Professor Valence.